talking about how KDE is big is kind of an important topic, I think, because KDE is so big that it kind of gives us big project problems, right?
Mm,
Like when you have a small project, a lot of things are easy or at least doable. And once you have a big project, you start to run into these issues of internal coordination, how to
mm,
find anything, preserving institutional memory, making sure people know who's doing what, making sure small projects within the umbrella project don't get forgotten or abandoned. It's really pretty huge. And one of the things that I think you can see in this is how KDE software is becoming used more widely across the industry.
mm,
There's the obvious thing that we can all think of, which is the Steam Deck, of course, which is a phenomenal success. But there are other things too, like the German company Tuxedo Computers, which is a whole company. And I've visited their headquarters. They have a whole floor in an office building. They have lots of people. Their whole company sells devices that run plasma. So,
mm,
we're important to them too. And there's a whole bunch of other people who are using KDE software in institutional contexts
mm,
for making money, for doing real work. And so, as big as KDE is, it's equally important in world affairs. If KDE vanished tomorrow, there are a lot of people out there who would be scrambling for what to replace that software with.
mm,
And I think it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem in some ways because KDE is still very much a volunteer directed project. Even though
mhm,
there are a lot of people who are sponsored to work on it, it's still mostly volunteers.
mm,
And so we're kind of in a transitional phase right now where the project started as a fairly loose knit thing that was made by individual people. And
mm,
now our work is being consumed by hundreds of thousands, millions of people out there who maybe don't have that much familiarity with open source, right? And
mm,
who come at the project with a product mindset where they say, well, this isn't working. What's wrong with you? Why
mhm.
didn't that work properly? And on one hand, we can say, well, just look at the warranty, right? Every file in the Git repo says there's no warranty implied or
Provided
otherwise
as
for it,
is, well, whatever specific
provided
license
as
you're
is,
using,
right?
yeah.
And technically and legally, that is true,
Mhm.
but it's also not what people are expecting.
Right.
And I think we do sort of a bad job of setting expectations there, right?
Mhm,
When you go to a Linux distro's website and you download it, it's going to give you the fancy glossy marketing copy. And it's going to tell you about how great the distro is and this and that. You're not going to see a giant red disclaimer that says, by the way, there's no warranty. If you're not paying for this, there's no expectation of what you should receive in return.
mhm.
And so be prepared for things to break terribly.
Yeah.
Like people like you and I, we know that. We know that implicitly. And when our friends and relatives tell us, I'm really tired of Windows or Mac OS, I think I want to move to Linux,
Mhm.
we're going to give them that little speech, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of regular people out there are not having this information communicated to
Mhm,
them. And so then the problem becomes, do we want to communicate this information to them so that we're setting expectations? Or do we want to try to make it irrelevant so that they don't get frustrated by issues in the first place, right?
mhm.
It's a little bit of both. You want to set expectations, but you also don't want to pull a bait and switch where you're saying, oh, this project is so great, you should use it, it's so much better than the competition. Then when people run into problems, you say, well, not my problem, whatever, it's all volunteers.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I was speaking to sorry, I'm blanking- Christian Scheller, I think that's what his name is from Red Hat. Um, and he was saying the other day that he doesn't like a lot of the time when we have issues on the Linux desktop, the solution is either well, I don't think he said this, but he said he did definitely bring up usually it's try a different desktop or use a different project. A lot of other times it's well, you can commit code upstream, you can fix the problem yourself, and both of these are great if we're talking purely the developer mindset, the developer community. And in the very early days of Linux, when that was the people using Linux and that was the people using open source, that made a lot of sense. When we're talking back in like 1999, for example, nobody is using Debian unless they're a developer or have a developer adjacent position. Like, you weren't having regular normal people who were just like working a 9 to 5. They're a plumber running Debian back then. But
Right,
now
exactly.
it's a
Yeah.
very different position, especially with people who are, they're replacing the Windows 7 on their parents' computer with something that's actually supported.
Yep.
It's a
Yep.
very tough problem, and obviously the really big projects like KDE, like GNOME, like I don't know. There's actually not that I mean, the Linux kernel. There's really few
True.
projects that fit this camp that can afford to really do some sort of like proper product-like support. But when you start doing that, then you possibly also start setting expectations for things outside of just the desktop, and that's where it gets really difficult,
Yeah.
right? Because you can set expectations for what is going to come from Plasma, but if somebody installs a application as a Flatpak, for example, and it's just some random application, one dude maintains it, you can't have that same level of expectation. But especially in the case of a product, like you're buying a computer, if maybe something is pre-installed, that's going to have that same sort of expectation placed on it as well. And I don't know how you address this problem.
It's very challenging for sure. I think the only way that you can actually address this is with vertical integration,
Mhm.
which is very much beyond our capacity to do right now. But you're absolutely right that it's a problem because a normal person is accustomed to a product being self-contained, right?
Mhm.
And computers violate this expectation a little bit because when you get a computer, you get it from your local retailer and you power it up. Let's say it's a Windows computer,
Sure.
right? Uh, you know that the company that made the computer is probably not Microsoft, although maybe it is, but it has the company's name and logo on it. And then you boot it up and it's got Windows, and you know that Windows comes from Microsoft. And then it comes with a whole bunch of other random software on it. And people like you and I often forget, but in the Windows world, a lot of random software is prominently branded with the company name on it so that people know who it came from, because otherwise this is not very obvious. But even then, people have trouble, right? People have trouble distinguishing third-party apps versus first-party apps. And even in the Windows world, right? There are people who are going to not understand the difference between an Asus and a Microsoft. The fact that even then, that this is a product that is composed of components from multiple vendors is a little challenging. In the Mac world, that's not the case, right? Because Apple makes the hardware and Apple makes the software, and Apple doesn't bundle any third-party software on their machines, I think. So it's a clearer, simpler story there.
Right.
And I think as a result, there's sort of an easier user experience, and that's the thing that we have to shoot for, if you ask me.
I think
Obviously,
a good
we're
example
not
of
in the
this.
hardware game right now, and maybe at some point in the future we will be, but I think this is why you see KDE has a distro, KDE Neon, and much hay has been made of KDE Neon. And after the release of Plasma 6, there were some problems, and we've been discussing internally how to fix those. But I think it's a good thing that we have our own distribution channel somehow, and whether we can improve that over time is something that we're going to be looking at. But it's good because it means that we can't pass the buck as much, right? When you have a problem with the packaging on, let's say, Ubuntu or Fedora, we can say, well, it's an upstream issue, talk to them.
Right.
But if you have a packaging problem on Neon, we can say, oops, we messed up. We can fix it. And that is a more satisfying response to hear if you are in the role of a customer and you feel like you're having a problem and you're seeking a solution.
I think a good example of people being confused about like what in the stack is like owned by who. I don't know if people say this around where you are, but I'll often hear people compare Samsung versus iPhone. Like they don't even know that Android exists. It's just Samsung or I don't know if that's still like the big brand right now. I don't care about like smartphones, but like a couple of years back, that's the way people describe it, because this whole concept of there being a separate operating system and there being these separate applications, it's just not the way that like maybe they'll think of something like, I don't know, some game they install as like a separate thing that's from a different company, but the idea that Samsung doesn't make the thing that runs their phone, like that's just not even something that goes into their heads.
Yeah. And this makes sense too, right? Because who are you buying your phone from? You're buying it from Samsung. And let's say you buy your phone from Samsung and you have a problem with it.
Mhm.
And that problem happens to be in a layer of the stack provided by Google
Mhm.
in the form of Android. And you go to Samsung for support, you're expecting Samsung to support you. If somebody in Samsung says, well, we just ship Google software, so you'll have to talk to Google. Like, that's not going to fly, right?
Mhm.
And this is the expectation that we do have in our community. You file a bug report on KDE. If it happens to be an issue in a third-party library, we're going to pawn you off on that library. We're not going to take responsibility for it. And that's because we can't. But if you're an integrator, if you're a distro or you're a hardware vendor, you can take responsibility for it.
Mhm.
And so I think in a lot of ways, in an ideal scenario, most of the bug reports that come to KDE would not actually be filed by users. They
Mhm.
would be filed by distro maintainers. They would be filed by QA people working for hardware vendors,
Mhm.
because they would be the people who get the issues reported to them first, because as the integrators, as the ones who sell the products, they're the ones who are ultimately in the best position to figure out what exactly the issue it is and what can be done about it.
Hmm.
Because after all, money has changed hands, right?
Right.
When you
Right. Right.
buy, let's say you buy a computer from Tuxedo, right?
Sure.
I brought them up earlier. You spend your, 1,000 euros on a nice computer,
Mhm.
and you find that it doesn't work in a particular way. Well, if you contact the Tuxedo people, then they're going to have like a warranty system. They're going to have a customer service department who can talk to you. They're going to have people who can figure it out, who are at least ostensibly being paid by the money that's changed hands. Whereas if you buy a laptop from, let's say, Lenovo, and then you wipe Windows and you put KDE, let's say, I don't know, Fedora 39 KDE on it,
Mhm.
well, no money has changed hands there, right? So when you go and you talk to KDE, implicitly, everything that you're asking for is free support.
Mhm.
And even among the Fedora people who are happy that you're using their distro, if you ask for support from them, it's going to again be free support, right? None of this is paid support. And so whatever you get from that is kind of on a best effort basis.
Mhm.
So I think when people come at issues that they're experiencing from the perspective of a customer, it really needs to be that they're talking to somebody who they've given money to, because then there
Mhm.
is an explicit expectation of support for money, right?
Mhm.